Well, first of all, thanks for having me. You just recited our recent experience with the Ebola vaccine. I think this vaccine situation is very different because of the incredible pressure that I think everyone feels to get a vaccine that is safe and effective given the global pandemic that we're facing. So what I would say is that we're going to try to approach this in a very responsible but also aggressive fashion. So I'm not in a position today to say exactly what the timeline will be. We're going to move as quickly and as responsibly as we can. As you know, clinical trials take a long time, and if you're going to immunize a lot of people, millions if not billions of people, you're going to have to make sure that you know exactly what that vaccine will do in people, and you can essentially ensure the safety of people.
Absolutely. And you told me this morning that you're planning on moving into phase 1 trials for one of those vaccines, the one from Themis, within just a few weeks. Tell us what that path looks like in terms of clinical trials, and also whether, if all goes well, Merck will be participating in that major U.S. clinical trial being coordinated by the NIH that we heard about last week in a Reuters report.
So as you know, we announced today that we're going to be working on two different vaccines, the IV vaccine that's got the VSV platform that we used in Ebola. We're very confident about that, as well as the Themis platform, which is using the measles virus vector. We're also very confident about that. The Themis platform is a little bit up ahead, and as I said this morning to you, Meg, we expect to go into phase 1 studies with that vaccine in a matter of weeks. If those go well, then later this year we'll be going into phase 2 studies to evaluate the efficacy. We also expect to get into clinical studies later this year with the IV vaccine.
You also announced a deal today for an antiviral drug, which people are very excited about. The potential for a pill to treat or even prevent this disease would be incredibly helpful. That's a drug from Ridgeback Bio and was actually highlighted in the former BARDA director Rick Bright's whistleblower lawsuit recently, where he highlighted some safety concerns with similar drugs in the class potentially causing reproductive toxicities. What have you observed in terms of the safety of this drug in this class, and how do you ensure for that as you proceed with human trials?
Well, we're very pleased to be in a partnership with Ridgeback for this antiviral. And what we did before we entered into this was to look very carefully at the phase 1 data, which showed that if you use this at the kinds of dosages that should be useful in blocking the replication of the virus, that you did so in a way that was well tolerated in patients. The issue that you raised is an important issue, however. Normally you wouldn't be going forward with the drug unless you had done the kinds of studies to ensure that you wouldn't cause any kinds of problems, for example, with respect to mutagenic issues. But again, this pandemic is different, and we're studying this. It's important to remember that we're studying this first in people who are already sick. This drug, like remdesivir, the Gilead drug, we think will block replication. The benefit of this, as you said, is it's a pill. It's an oral drug which can be used earlier, and by the way, can be used easier and can be scaled up to make billions of doses. But we're going to have to carefully proceed, and we're not studying it in the first instance as a prophylactic to prevent people from getting sick.
I wonder if you can give us a sense, you're undertaking 3 different projects you laid out here today. What kind of investment Merck is prepared to make in all of these different programs for COVID-19? We've heard from Pfizer, they're potentially laying out $1 billion. Gilead investing up to $1 billion in remdesivir as well. J&J $500 million in its vaccine program. What's Merck willing to spend on this?
We're going to spend what it takes. We have the capacity, the financial capacity, the human resources capacity to prosecute these 3 programs simultaneously or in parallel. We're very excited by both vaccine programs. The fact of the matter is we had an opportunity to take a step back and say, which programs do we think are the most promising programs? And we wanted to find the kinds of programs that will allow us to develop vaccines that can be deployed broadly. We wanted to make sure that we had things that could work with a single dose. That's incredibly important, that you have the kinds of things that you can be confident could work with a single dose. And lastly, we wanted to use proven platforms, and the 2 platforms that we have, the measles virus platform as well as the VSV platforms, are things that have been approved for use in people. So we know that they're safe. We know that they're effective. For example, the VSV platform that you talked about our Ebola vaccine, the World Health Organization has estimated that it's effective in 97.5% of people after just one dose. So we wanted those kinds of live, attenuated, or weakened virus platforms that we think will stimulate the strong immunity that we need to have the kind of protection with a single shot.
And it's Sarah Eisen. I mean, as you know, as the expert on vaccines, some viruses you can't have a vaccine, like HIV. How confident are you that this virus, COVID-19, can be eradicated via vaccine?
From everything I hear from our scientists, we have a reasonable degree of confidence. You know, this is a new virus, so there's a lot that's not known about the virus and its reaction in terms of the immune system, but there's strong confidence on the part of our scientists that we can get a vaccine. And I think the other thing that's really important is that across the industry, now, no one company can solve this problem. All of our industry colleagues are bringing different approaches to vaccines. And if you look at all of that together, I have a great deal of confidence and optimism that we will have vaccines against this pandemic.
I want to ask about some of your industry peers or competitors. So Moderna says that it's possible to have a vaccine by the end of the year. Even Dr. Fauci, who's generally pretty cautious, said it's realistic to expect by the end of the year. Why are you giving a longer time frame for yours? I mean, this is a company, Moderna, that's never even put out a vaccine. You've got plenty of experience in doing that.
Each of these platforms has a very different set of characteristics, and speed may very well be an advantage to the platform that Moderna is using. And again, I'll stress, you know, we're racing against the virus here, and we're rooting for everybody to succeed. We have a lot of hands-on experience, as you just alluded to, with respect to the Ebola vaccine. We have hands-on experience with these live, weakened viruses, and we feel that they're the best approach for us to take because of the things that I said, including significantly that we can actually have reasonable confidence that a single dose will confer the kind of protection that we need. So each one of these has a different platform, they have different characteristics, and so it makes sense that the timelines might be very different.
But realistically, Ken, when do you think it's realistic that the whole nation, indeed many other nations too, will have been successfully vaccinated? Is that a 2020 event?
Well, I have to say, we don't have confidence that we can come forward in that short time period with a vaccine that can be used. And I think your question actually raises a second issue. There's a scientific challenge around getting a safe and effective vaccine. But the next issue is how quickly can you scale up? And one of the reasons why we chose the two platforms that we have is we have deep experience with both those platforms. We know how to make them, we know how to scale up those particular platforms, and we're investing a lot at risk to be able to make hundreds of millions of doses by the end of this year if we're successful.
Regardless of the timeline, Ken, it was good to see you say that you're optimistic ultimately that you or your industry will eventually find a treatment or a vaccine that successfully offsets this virus. Clearly, the healthcare industry has been very much in the crosshairs, whether it's from politicians or the media in recent years, as it always is, but particularly in recent years. In a couple of years' time, when we look back on this, do you think the way the healthcare industry has responded will allow the pressure to ease in terms of what the industry has faced in recent years? Or do you think quite the opposite, that if there's even $1 of profit that is made by healthcare companies in these years, that it will sort of reinvigorate criticism that healthcare executives in the industry faces?
I certainly hope that people will look at the industry differently. As you can see, almost every company that has the wherewithal to try to respond to this situation is throwing in lots of resources. I think it reminds people that we need a healthy, strong industry for the next pandemic. You know, this is not necessarily the last situation that we're going to face where we have a viral pandemic or a bacterial pandemic, and we want to make sure that we have the kind of resources in place. I'll just give it as an example. We've been committed to antibiotic research for years. It's not a very profitable field, but we want to make sure that with these resistant bacteria, which will, according to many scientists, kill more people than climate change in 2050, that we have the right kind of antibiotics to protect humankind from it.
I know that already, as you said, the whole industry is kind of supporting each other on this at this time to kind of get a vaccine going. I guess in normal times, Ken, you compete very much with other big healthcare companies, and you want to get your drug out there first and show why yours is the best. Is there anything more that the industry could be doing in terms of teaming up with typical rivals that could see one vaccine come together perhaps quicker than while everyone's sort of still competing, even if competing with a more positive perspective than normal?
Well, again, I don't think we're competing against other companies, and a lot of information is being shared. For example, if we're going to scale up and make billions of doses, there's no question that we're all going to have to get behind whatever are the best vaccine candidates for the world. So I think there's been a lot of sharing, and it's not the first time. If you go back to the early days of HIV/AIDS research, a very similar thing happened. We tried to make sure that we bring together people to share the right kind of information so that we can all be advanced in terms of our ability to deal with this pandemic. And I think this industry is doing that. Obviously, we are individual companies. We are pursuing different avenues, but I think it's good for society that we're doing different kinds of avenues and approaches. I think that's why I'm optimistic that a lot of smart people in a lot of different places employing different strategies and different platforms are trying to solve the same issue.
I just wanted to follow up, Ken, on the antiviral that you've obviously partnered with. And you mentioned to Meg that you weren't looking at using it prophylactically. So what kind of patients are you looking at using it? Can you take it at the first sign, say, of a fever or symptoms? And what kind of evidence do you have that it works? Because there was a lot of hope around Fujifilm and Japan's oral antiviral, and then basically didn't show that it worked in a study, and it was a huge disappointment.
Well, to clarify, what I was saying is that the first studies will be in people who are infected. They won't be in people who are healthy. So we're not studying it in the first instance in people who would need a prophylactic treatment. But what we saw in phase 1 is that this was a drug that blocked the replication of the virus, much as remdesivir did. And we know remdesivir has led to improved outcomes for patients in studies already. And what we want to do is make sure that as we move on to phase 2, that we try to ensure that we can show the level of effectiveness. But right now, the data that we see tells us that at the levels that are necessary to block the replication of the virus, that this is a safe compound, and that gives us real optimism that this could be an important agent, either standing alone or in combination with another drug like remdesivir.
Ken, it's Meg Terrell again. I want to ask you about the geopolitical influences that are at work here that we're already observing in the vaccine race. As part of your deal with IAVI, you received $38 million in funding from BARDA, from the U.S. government. Does that come with any strings, any guarantees that you need to supply the United States first? And what kinds of pressures are you feeling from around the world?
Well, the initial funding we have from BARDA, we appreciate, but it did not come with a contractual obligation to provide doses to one country versus another. We think the right way to think about this, and you're right, there is now geopolitical pressure. There are other countries that are asking for us to make sure that they are included in the first doses. We think the right thing to do is to look at population risk groups. So, for example, frontline healthcare workers, for example, elderly people, people who have comorbid conditions. We want to make sure that this vaccine gets to the people who are at highest risk. Of course, we want to make sure that it's available to people in the United States and in other countries in Europe. But Merck has a long track record also of working with nonprofit organizations, with governments around the world, to ensure that these important life-saving vaccines get to people in low-income countries. I think it's important for us to remember that this vaccine shows that it doesn't respect borders. So in a way, you could actually say that until all of us are safe, none of us are safe.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, a lesson we learned during Ebola as well. And, my final question to you, I just want to ask you about something that Dr. Peter Pyatt wrote recently in Science. He's an influential virologist and a lot of work in Ebola and HIV. He got the coronavirus and spent a week recovering in the hospital. And afterwards he wrote, quote, "Without a coronavirus vaccine, we will never be able to live normally again." Do you agree with that?
Well, I'm not a scientist or a physician, and I won't contradict him. The reason why we're pursuing these two vaccine programs is because we believe that it's critical for the world to have a protective agent against this disease. We're in the pandemic phase, but if we're lucky enough to get past that, there will be an endemic phase. So, for example, we've been vaccinating the birth cohort against measles for 40 years. Measles, we've been able to suppress it, to almost eradicate it, but it isn't gone. Even things like tuberculosis can come back. So we want to make sure that the world has a protective agent that's safe and effective. Once again, I'll say it's really important from our perspective, a single-dose vaccine is the right way to try to immunize the world.
Ken Frazier, thanks so much for being here with us today, and we'll eagerly stay tuned on your progress.
Always a pleasure, and we're rooting for everybody in this industry to be successful.